Hi there, my name is Andy Miah, and it's a real pleasure to have the chance to speak with you today about my work on Sport 2.0, which is a journey that's taken me really throughout my career across 20 years almost now, and it began in the Sydney 2000 Olympic Games, which I think is almost 20 years exactly as of today, when I'm recording this in September. And over that journey, I've seen so much change in the world of sport and so much integration of technology. In fact, I began my journey partly through technology. I was writing a PhD about genetics in sport, and I was doing it at a time where another major revolution was taking place, the digital revolution. And I felt very early on in my research that I couldn't ignore either one of those eras. And so I studied digital and studied genetics alongside each other. And of course, this was a huge moment in time where the world was suddenly becoming online. In fact, the Sydney 2000 Olympic Games was the second Olympic Games to have a website at all. And I benefited from this because I went to Sydney and I went there really for conferences to take part in scientific events. But I learned at the time that there was this place called the Non-Accredited Media Centre, which at that point to me was just complete mystery as to what it is. I understood the Olympic Games involved sports journalists going to the city, covering the sports, broadcasting and reporting on everything that happened. But I learned very quickly that there's a huge population of journalists that go to the Olympics not to cover the sports, but to cover everything else around it, the culture, the politics, the local, national stories that come out of it. And of course, the Olympic movement is such a kind of controversial, newsworthy event that it's something that many journalists from all walks of life come to write about and to discuss. So you'd have people from the New York Times, from Reuters, from all the news wires that were there, covering everything other than the sports, the protests, the way in which the city would mobilize around this huge event, all the impacts it had on local citizens. So I went to this non-accredited media centre, and I asked if I could be accredited. You still had to be registered and have an accreditation with you to be present within it. And they asked me, well, who am I? What am I doing? And I said, well, I'm publishing work online. And I showed them my website. And at this time, I had a website, which was quite unusual. And they looked at it. They saw I was publishing in the media articles here and there whilst I was doing my PhD. And they gave me an accreditation. And that began a 20-year career path into studying media change at the Olympic Games, which has taken me in so many different directions and really sort of underpins everything that I write about within the book called Sport 2.0, which is really in two parts. It's partly a journey of that Olympic period where I look at the research and data that's come out of those years of capturing insights from each of those Olympic Games, from Sydney all the way up to the Pyeongchang 2018 Olympic Games. And discusses how digital's become a present and driving force in how the Olympic movement thinks about its core business. When I started off, we were at the point where the main thing, and it still pretty much is the main thing, but where the conversations about the economics of the Olympic movement are driven by discussions about the sale of television rights to territories. So you would have, and have for many years now, had bidding wars where broadcasters would battle to provide the best, most compelling bid for the right to broadcast the games. But what was really interesting with the Rio Olympic Games in 2016 is at the end of those games, the Olympic Committee, the International Olympic Committee, always talks about the impact in television viewing hours. But for the first time, they talked instead about the number of live streamed hours. So we see now this transition from television to digital and all the many platforms that involves. And I think what's really profound is just to see how much there is happening online through digital sports at the moment, which just tells a story of that migration from traditional television to multimedia immersive environments. And it's not just about that, though. It's also about the longer history of the international sports media. And if you think about it, every Olympic Games from perhaps, let's say, 1936 with Hitler's games in Berlin, which for the first time created film that was showing the muscularity of athletes. In fact, the Leni Riefenstahl film Olympia has become an iconic emblem of sports broadcasting and sports filmmaking that's informed many other filmmakers. So very early on in the development of international elite sports, we saw the creation of storytelling around that, which has become even more compelling as the technology has developed. And so Sport 2.0 isn't just about one thing. It's, in fact, that notion of 2.0, which is in the context of the phrase Web 2.0, is very much indicative of the main message of the book, which is that digital has become all pervasive and capable of moving across all our different environments. In fact, Web 2.0 really characterized a shift in how digital content could be moved. So in the Web 1.0 era, where you had websites that were static, HTML based, and really the content that was created had to stay within those environments, is remarkably different from the situation we're in today, where content can be moved from one platform to the next. And that shift, that dynamic disconnection between content and coding, is what's allowed the disruption to occur, not just within the sports media, but in the media industries more widely. And we see this in quite tangible ways where, I don't know, things like TikTok, which has become a platform that many people are looking at right now as a sort of indication of where the media is going. One of its successes is built on the fact that you can easily export TikTok content to many other platforms. The model has been for many environments to actually limit that freedom so that everyone is brought into that single environment, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. These have all been relatively enclosed, locked places, but TikTok allows the content to be shared across environments and always includes a logo that shows that it's a TikTok video. So there's changes that have been brought about by these digital innovations that are still very much dynamic. And you can look at international sports and see how these shifts have occurred, because of course those organizations involved with broadcasting the sports are not just sports broadcasters. They are big transnational organizations deeply embedded with a whole range of technology networks and innovators who are passionate about continually advancing the art of media production. And you see this over the last 100 years of Olympic sports media, where you have everything from slow motion replay to underwater film and 360 filmmaking and even virtual reality, which has been used for the first time at the Rio 2016 Olympic Games, where I think it was around 60 hours were shot in 360 and then rendered for a VR experience. And all of this language, all of this innovation has become such a central part of what the elite sports world is all about, that it's now part of the currency. You see this in the form of the businesses that take part in sponsoring elite sports. In fact, if you go to the Olympic Games, one of the things that I always say is that if you go to the Games, you don't need any tickets to have an amazing time, because in fact the whole city is mobilized to have a whole range of other events that take place that you can enjoy and be part of, even if you don't have a sports ticket at all. One of the big things you see around the city are sponsor pavilions. So all those big names, Samsung, Intel, local sponsors as well, they all have kind of showcased environments that are designed to tell people about their next generation of products. I saw I think it was in Pyeongchang in 2018, I saw Samsung's foldable mobile phone. It was still sort of prototype stage and it was still quite early on, but it was what they were telling us about for the next generation of their mobile phones. And this has become, I would say, in 20 years certainly, a significant part of that Olympic experience. And innovation is at the heart of it. And of course, it's at the heart of it partly because the Olympic Games relies on huge amounts of advanced infrastructure. You think about the way in which cybersecurity is set up around the Games to avoid major disasters, the logistics implied with transporting thousands of journalists and athletes around the city. These are major operations. They are really pushing the boundaries of what societies can do. And so the best industries are at the heart of the entire production. And this cuts across everything from setting up the best broadband and Wi-Fi or transfer of data to having the best journalists and theatre directors involved in producing things like the opening ceremonies. So the Olympic Games should be thought of as a place where you can discover the cutting edge of all forms of theatrical staging. And of course it makes sense because sports themselves are a theatre. They're a production of sort of unreal experiences that sort of sit outside of society. And that's why I think it's always helpful to think about sports as places of kind of storytelling, which is of course what the media do best. It's they tell compelling stories about athletes' journeys and the struggles they face in pursuit of transcending human limits. These are, some of the most compelling stories in our societies, and we love them. We find it inspiring to be witnesses to these transformative achievements that athletes undertake. And this kind of leads me quite nicely into thinking about the world of esports. So I want to draw a line between those sort of early experiments with media production around the Olympic Games and what we're seeing now with the world of esports emerging as really the next generation of how we consume content. And for a few years now, it's taken a long time to get the message across that esports are something really important to watch and crucial that athletes, and not just athletes, but also sports producers really think about trying to access, understand, and be a part of. Because what we're seeing is a real transformation of how people consume content, how content's produced, and also then how it's monetized. So I remember taking a train a few months ago now, before the COVID lockdown, where a number of carriages were completely full, and I remember this lad who was maybe in his early 20s watching something on his mobile phone, and I thought, what was it, some sort of football match or television, and I glanced over to the phone and it was a computer game. He was watching a streaming of a computer game. And what we've seen over the last 5 years, maybe even just the last 3, is the rise of this kind of content consumption. People want to watch other people play computer games, and this is now becoming a huge industry. And it's really interesting if you think about this in comparison to television, because I remember another small anecdote where I was in a garage and there was a big screen on and there was a football match being played, and I wasn't sure what football match was taking place that day, but I walked closer to it and then discovered that this was a FIFA tournament that was taking place. So it was a computer game experience, but the graphics looked so real, the gameplay looked so real that I couldn't tell the difference. And I think what we've seen, especially over this COVID lockdown period, where sports have had to figure out completely new ways of working and delivering experiences for their audiences, is a whole range of experiments with these platforms. Everything from Zwift, which is the cycling simulator where you put your own bicycle into the machine and it translates your output into a computer-generated world where you can see then cyclists competing alongside each other. These have now become major events around the world with huge amounts of elite athletes taking part within them. In fact, just this year also, the International Olympic Committee president said, and this was very not controversial, but certainly a step change in attitude toward esports. He said these weren't simulating sports, these were sports. And I think this recognition that the increasing immersiveness of esports activity through full body experiences is showing us that in fact there are ways in which that kind of activity can be part of what people see as conventional sports. It's possible that esports could enter the Olympic Games by certainly embracing some of these more immersive full body experiences. And it's also important to think about why that's crucial when you consider the future, because of course for many years now we've been locked into an interface with a computer which is very reliant on keyboards, very reliant on our hands, but that's changing. We now have much more that's voice activated, we have much more that's gesture based, and we have a completely different way of interacting with the world through immersive virtual realities. So one of the reasons why digital is so central to the future of sport is because these interfaces are changing. We are saying goodbye to the keyboard. We are saying goodbye. In fact, we're saying goodbye to the intermediary between our thoughts and some kind of output. And there are scientists working on some remarkable technologies that are allowing us to imagine the possibility that simply by thinking something, we can then have an impact on the physical world. Not requiring a translation either in action, physical action, or indeed by writing something or transcribing something. So the future of sports is deeply wedded to these innovations that are transforming how we think of ourselves and our relationship with others. It's as profound as this. And that's why the subject of digital technology in sport is so compelling, is that it shows us how the physicality of our human existence can interface with the growing digitality of our lives. And the challenge, of course, is to make sure that we don't lose too much of each of those worlds so that we end up in a worse position. We want to maintain the joyfulness of seeing somebody physically break world records, but also find ways of making sure that we can be present to share that with others through digital platforms. And so I suppose that the really exciting part of this is how we do that most effectively. And lots of people have different views about what we can do to make that possible. We have the idea that we will have not just digital or physical experiences of sports, but blended hybrid activities where there's a combination of those two things together. And we see that partly in what the company Virtually Live is doing with creating virtual reality experiences of physical races as they're taking place, but which also allow the spectators to ghost race on their own console whilst the race is happening. So we're seeing a much more blended approach to thinking through those interactions. And at the heart of it, for many organizations, it goes back to what I was speaking about earlier, which is that transition from an economy where investments in the media are predicated on television audiences to one where everything is driven by data insights that emerge out of those platforms. The best way to access understanding about audiences is through their habitual use of these digital environments. And so if you can bring everybody into your digital ecosystem and monitor their behavior, their consumption, or their preferences, that's a more effective way to then exploit their interests and desires. Now, we want to be critical of that because, of course, it also means that we're subjects who are then affected by these wider trajectories that limit our own freedom to know what's going on in our lives. So it's a quite worrying situation where so much knowledge is within the machine that's limiting then our own freedom. But this is what we have to grapple with as a society, how far we're prepared to take this. And one of my concerns is that if we don't really wrestle with that and understand the impact of increasingly digital lives, we may limit our ability to live freely, enjoy the things we care about, and avoid being exploited. So the subject of Sport 2.0 isn't just about elite sports participation. It's not just about spectating, it's about the whole of society and coming to a conclusion where we're comfortable with the increasing exploitation of our data, which is why every time you track your data on Strava or Google Fit, whatever it might be, you have to think about what is the impact of that behavior and how does it affect not just your freedom, but the freedom of a population, of a society, to actually marshal that information in a way that may be productive for some notion of public good. And it's there where I'll leave you to think about these wider implications and why digital technology in sport is completely all-encompassing. Thanks very much.